a 64-year-old Mafia matriarch took 2 bullets to the chest.
Why?
To save the very granddaughter she secretly to be banished 5 years ago. Isabella Moretti ruined her son's life with a $500, 0 zeros in bribe, and a brutal threat. But when a rival cartel traps them in a warehouse, she makes the ultimate bloody sacrifice. This is a story of Mafia royalty, a puppy with a bandaged paw, and a redemption arc that will leave you absolutely speechless. Today, you and I are going to unpack this clinical file together. We are looking at a subject named Lorenzo Moretti. The setting is Interstate 94, a brutal November storm swallowing the Chicago asphalt. He sits in the back of an armored convoy, encased in deafening, freezing silence, unique to men who orchestrate violence for a living. From a psychological natural standpoint of view, Lorenzo is entirely numb. We absorb of subjects who chase ultimate power, believing control will cure their internal void. But when you systematically kill your own empathy to survive in the underworld, you simply become a ghost, haunting a very expensive armored cage. The lesson here is profound. Power without humanity is just a heavier chain. Observe his facial micro-expressions as the harsh streetlights wash over him. Lorenzo is only 37, yet his flat blue eyes exhibit the severe clinical exhaustion of chronic trauma. He recently decimated a rival syndicate, yet his resting pulse remains entirely unchanged. This is the baseline of a shattered psyche. 5 years prior, a woman named Elena left him, completely fracturing his emotional core. In my practice, I find that subjects will cling to an old, agonizing ache because that specific pain is the only empirical proof their heart still functions. Up front, his enforcer Dante stares into a phone screen. We learn quickly in behavioral analysis that winning the war means absolutely nothing if your own house is empty. Marco, the driver, exhibits the hypervigilance of a man conditioned by 20 years of survival. Suddenly, a severe stressor alters the environment. He slams the brakes, sending the massive vehicle skidding violently across the flooded highway. In the immediate aftermath, Dante draws his weapon, his amygdala firing, fully expecting a hostile ambush. Instead, illuminated in the blinding headlights, stands a tiny, shivering puppy. It is a fascinating psychological disruption. We spend decades constructing impenetrable mental walls, fully convinced the world is entirely hostile, yet life will deliberately place something incredibly helpless in our path. It is a fundamental test, forcing us to remember how to care for another living thing. This exhausted animal stands completely frozen against the freezing wind, staring blindly at a machine designed for slaughter. Dante paranoia spikes instantly. He views this anomaly as a deliberate decoy, demanding they accelerate. This reveals his deeply ingrained survival pathology. Lorenzo, however, remains completely still. He raises a single hand, and the cabin falls into immediate submission. The puppy struggles through the sludge and presses its muddy paws against the thick glass. Stick with me here, because this behavioral pivot is crucial. Real courage is not demonstrated by physical dominance or aggressive posturing. It is the raw, internal fortitude required to step toward your deepest terror, hoping one massive risk might save a life. When Lorenzo finally turns his head, the violent storm seems to psychologically mute itself. The animal locks eyes with the most dangerous subject in the city. There is zero fear in the puppy's gaze, only a desperate, piercing grief that bypasses Lorenzo's defense mechanisms entirely. Dante is actively escalating, his anger masking severe anxiety, practically begging his boss to ignore the anomaly. But Lorenzo completely dissociates from his enforcer's panic. He shoves the heavy door open, allowing the bitter wind to shatter the sterile environment. You can bury your humanity under decades of clinical detachment and violence, but true compassion is a stubborn virus. It only takes one microscopic fracture for the soul to bleed out. The freezing water shocks Lorenzo system the exact second his shoes hit the asphalt. Rain is hiding the physiological reaction, the tears he had suppressed for half a decade. Up close, the subject sees the animal is severely malnourished, exhaling erratic clouds of breath, discarding his entire carefully constructed persona. This apex predator drops to one knee into the filthy water. The broken creature does not retreat. Its agonizing wait is over. From a sociological perspective, people will obey the power you project from a distance, but authentic loyalty requires vulnerability. Sometimes you have to ruin your armor and get your hands covered in filth to prove you still value a fragile existence. The animal does not surrender to comfort. Instead, it bites down violently on Lorenzo-esque clothing, physically dragging the mob boss toward a pitch-black tree line. This triggers a total breakdown in Dante's psychological regulation. He screams over the howling wind, his voice raw with pure panic. 4 guards immediately breach the perimeter, sweeping the dark woods with tactical rifles. Dante is entirely convinced this is a complex trap. When subjects build massive cognitive walls of paranoia to keep enemies out, those same walls and destroy their vision. If your brain is wired to expect a lethal threat in every shadow, you will remain completely blind to the desperate pleas for help happening mere inches from your own boots. Dante is verbally catastrophizing, aggressively warning of a hidden sniper in the brush. Lorenzo exhibits total auditory exclusion regarding his enforcer, his focus locked exclusively on the traumatized animal. The dog is practically strangling itself to pull him forward. Slowly, Lorenzo rises to his full height. His tailored coat is drenched, yet his eyes show a complete absence of fear. He issues a flat, unemotional command to Marco, selecting him and 2 others for the descent, explicitly rejecting Dante. This demonstrates a vital psychological truth. If you want to uncover the reality hiding beneath a severe trauma you cannot observe safely from the perimeter, you must walk directly into the darkness and let the pain guide you. Dante immediately challenges the directive, unable to regulate his suspicion. Lorenzo enforces a heavy, dominant silence, commanding Dante to guard their only exit. You and I need to evaluate this specific interaction closely. For a microsecond, a highly malignant shadow crosses Dante's features. It could be severe narcissistic injury or the cold, calculated logic of an active traitor. Dante complies verbally, but his microexpressions betray him. As Lorenzo follows the flashlight beams into the dead woods, a harsh reality of criminal behavioral analysis becomes evident. In both the underworld and ordinary life, the loudest, most aggressive voice warning you about a hidden trap is very often the very person who set the wire. Up on the highway, Dante holds a rigid posture until his boss vanishes. Then, checking his blind spots, he retrieves a phone. This is classic detective behavior. Now, let us follow Lorenzo into the descent. The environmental stimuli shift violently as heavy timber suffocates the wind, reducing the storm to a sinister whisper. Flashlights expose jagged roots like exposed nerves. Lorenzo experiences a sudden acute pressure in his chest. This is not survival instinct. It is a somatic manifestation of the grief he repressed 5 years ago. Up ahead, the dog halts at a sheer drop. We all carry heavy, unresolved trauma until a random variable grabs us by the collar and forces us to look directly into its terrifying, empty eyes. The subject animal freezes at the precipice. It ears back, a classic fear response. yet it remains completely silent, staring into the absolute void. Marco's flashlight reveals severe structural violence, a massive, scorched skid mark destroying the steel guardrail pointing straight into the abyss. Lorenzo's sympathetic nervous system activates, his pulse pounding. 50 feet below, the beam illuminates as a catastrophic scene, a white vehicle, inverted and sinking into the mud. It operates as a stark metaphor for the human condition. The deepest, most destructive psychological tragedies are rarely displayed in plain sight. They are buried violently off the main path, rotting in the dark corners where nobody ever bothers to look. The wreckage is completely pulverized. Shattered glass catches the tactical lights, while the driver's side door hangs by deformed metal hinges. Thick smoke vents from the crushed engine block. For a moment, Lorenzo experiences minor respiratory paralysis. The clinical reality is horrifying. The occupant has been trapped inside that metal coffin for hours, long enough for a starving animal to scale a massive embankment and flag down a convoy of killers. Suddenly, the puppy emits an auditory cue that will permanently scar Lorenzo's psyche. It is not an anabusk, but a shattering, human-like scream of pure, unfiltered loss. Grief is the one universal, devastating language that absolutely every living creature speaks fluently. Let us examine this behavioral sequence together. A stray dog itself down a jagged ravine, sliding through freeze mud toward the smoking ruins of a crashed car. Up on the ridge, Marco screams for his employer to wait, but Lorenzo is already exhibiting pure hyperarousal. He throws himself over to the steep edge, tearing blindly through the dirt. Tree branches strike his face. A root tears his coat, and he hits the ground, hard, tasting bitter rain. Yet he forces himself back up without a single second of hesitation. Marco keeps shouting, but Lorenzo is locked in a tunnel vision of Martron's, hearing only his racing pulse. Sometimes, the only way to save a piece of our humanity is to completely block out the frantic voices of the world and leap toward what matters most. The scene frames the wreckage like a clinical study of judgment. Cold rain batters the asphalt, unable to wash away the suffocating stench of gasoline. The vapor hits Lorenzo, burning his throat before he reaches the crumpled steel. A dark puddle bleeds into the mud, creeping toward the hot engine block. One spark would vaporize everything. You and I know what a survivor of the Chicago underworld should do. His amygdala screams at him to flee. But he stops. Beside the smoking tires, a small puppy paws frantically at the shattered glass, whining into the storm. It brings us back to a simple lesson. Real courage is never an absence of fear. True bravery is making the conscious choice to take that terrifying step forward, right when the rest of the world tells you to look away. Lorenzo raises his flashlight, letting a cold beam slice through the twisted shadows. The light isolates a specific psychological trigger. A fragile hand hangs from the inverted roof, swaying in the freezing downpour. There are no expensive diamonds here. He sees just a plain silver band kept as a desperate anchor to a fading memory. Notice how his iron grip falters. The flashlight trembles in his fist. His brain is experiencing a severe maptic flashback. He used to hold a hand exactly like that in a life a bar removed from his criminal empire. He drops to his knees in the mud and peering into the crushed steel. It leaves us with a brutal lesson. The ghosts we try so desperately to outrun are usually waiting patiently for us, buried right inside the wreckage of our own choices. We observe the woman suspended in the driver's seat, restrained by a fraying seatbelt. Her dark hair spills toward the earth, obscuring her face. A line of crimson traces down her temple, falling onto the ruined dashboard. Her respiration has ceased entirely. Then, drifting from the deepest corner of that crushed tomb, Lorenzo catches a faint auditory signal. The storm almost swallows it, but he hears a child crying. His violent conditioning takes over instantly. Drawing his bill, he flips the heavy grip and swings it down like a hammer, exploding the window into a shower of glass and rain. This forceful breach reveals a simple truth we all must face. Sometimes, we have to completely shatter the harsh barriers placed in front of us to rescue the fragile innocence left shivering in the dark. The heavy rain beats down on the wreckage, creating a chaotic sensory environment. A narrow-eyed puppy darts away, spinning back with a panicked whine. Up the slope, Marco begs his boss to retreat before the gasoline ignites. Lorenzo exhibits absolutely no startled response. He crouches low into the smoking ruin. The air is thick with raw fuel and the copper stench of blood. Deep in the shadows, a tiny figure appears. A little girl hangs trapped upside down in her car seat, her pink dress stained with dark earth. It is a sobering reflection that the most innocent among us often endure the most devastating impacts of human chaos. This tragic reality teaches us why we must cultivate the unwavering strength to shield gentle souls from the violence of this brutal world. The child clutches a worn stuffed bear, clinging to this object as an anchor in a collapsing reality. She pulls weakly at the unconscious woman, her voice shattered. She begs her mother to wake up. In that agonizing second, the dissociative walls guarding Lorenzo's psyche finally break. Sweeping the glass aside with his tailored sleeve, he forces himself headfirst into the crushed metal. He twists his broad shoulders through the gap, letting the sharp steel slice deep into his flesh. His brain registers absolutely zero pain, overriding his nervous system entirely. Dragging his bare elbows across the broken glass, he reaches the driver. It is a striking illustration of how profound compassion can render us completely blind to our own bleeding, especially when a fragile soul needs our protection. Today, you and I are going to unpack the mind of a fractured kingpin. Look closely at the wreckage in this freezing ravine. The only sound is the dysregulated breathing of Lorenzo. This man built a brutal criminal empire on psychopathic control, yet right now, his hands are shaking violently. He brushes the wet, tangled hair from the injured woman's face, and his entire psychological architecture collapses. A wretched noise rips from his throat. It is Elena. Half a decade of cognitive dissonance, burying his grief in syndicate blood, simply vanishes as she bleeds out against the metal. We often tell ourselves that time heals our deepest wounds, but that is a dangerous myth. Time is merely a patient gravedigger. It buries our trauma in the subconscious, waiting for a violent storm to wash the dirt away. We constantly run from our repressed traumas, only to find them waiting at the end of the road. Lorenzo stares at Elena, tracing the pale lips he knew before his narcissism and the underworld entirely devoured his soul. A cold raindrop slides onto her bruised cheek, followed by a trembling tear, an emotional leak this ruthless sociopath would normally deny. Outside, Marco screams that the engine will detonate, but Lorenzo remains a statue, locked in acute paralysis. Then, a tiny voice shatters the silence. A terrified little girl peers from the crushed leather. Life has a brutal way of breaking our emotional numbness. Usually, right when an innocent life demands we finally wake up and act. Stick with me, because this is where the psychological profile cracks wide open. The child clutches a stuffed bear, her small voice shaking as she asks if he will save her mother. In the suspended, the fortified, detached core of this syndicate boss simply flatlines. Through the thick smoke, he truly looks at her, framed by tear lashes, Those piercing, icy blue eyes are a genetic mirror. They are his exact eyes staring back from the face of a daughter he never knew existed. The crushing gravity of this revelation shatters his megalomaniac ego instantly, leaving him choking on the metallic air. The ruined engine shrieks behind them. Destiny operates with a cruel irony. It often hands you the fragile key to your own redemption, right as your entire world is preparing to burn to the ground. Lorenzo forces his gravelly voice into an artificial softness, begging the traumatized girl to be brave. She nods, crushing the stuffed bear against her chest in a desperate self-soothing mechanism. We often forget that true resilience isn't measured by the rivals we destroy, by how gently we protect what is fragile. Lorenzo violently rips at the jammed seatbelt, but the melted plastic holds firm. With a sharp click, he draws his tactical knife. For a man whose entire behavioral pattern has been built on inflicting trauma, and this blade suddenly becomes an instrument of salvation. He slices the nylon in pulling her tiny frame against his chest. Curling his broad shoulders to shield her from the glass, he backs out into the freezing storm. The ruined vehicle groans, sliding deeper into the mud. Marco sprints down the slope, grabbing the shivering child to shield her. He screams for his boss to run, but Lorenzo freezes. You might be wondering the same thing I did. Why go back when survival dictates flight? A frantic puppy is trapped inside, barking over Elena, defying every hardwired preservation instinct. Lorenzo throws himself back into the volatile time bomb. Elena is pinned brutally, the belt crushing her ribs against the caved-in door. He methodically slides blade between the taut fabric and her chest, fighting his own adrenaline. It is incredibly easy to just walk away from a crisis, but standing firm in the center of the fire is what proves our humanity is still intact. Let's look at this final behavioral shift together. The first strap snaps, but the harness resists. From deep inside the engine, a tiny, sinister pop echoes. The quietest clinical warnings always arrive just before a total systemic collapse. Marco screams from the ridge as the final thread gives way, and Elena collapses against the very man who broke her world. Driven by a massive cortisol spike, Lorenzo hauls her over his shoulder, grabs the frantic dog, and launches out the window. They barely clear the steel before the tank detonates. A shockwave of fire slams his spine. Even in mid-air, his transformed psychology overrides self-preservation. He wraps his body around them, fully absorbing the bone-crushing impact. Real change demands we shield others from the blast. The twisted metal finally settles. Lorenzo lies draped over Elena, his coat smoking from the wreck. His spine screams in agony, yet his hypervigilance keeps paralyzed till he registers the faint rise of her chest. She is breathing. You and I must recognize that genuine resilience has nothing to do with the adversaries one destroys. True power is clinically measured by the suffering a mind willingly absorbs for a profound attachment. Behind them, the shattered car burns against the black sky. A fragile voice pierces the storm as the child cries out in raw trauma. Lorenzo forces his battered frame upward, the freezing rain washing blood from his bruised jaw. He locks on to her panicked gaze, completely shedding his ruthless syndicate armor, and gently promises the terrified girl her mother will survive. Examine this behavioral pivot closely. The girl stares upward, the relentless rain washing away her tears. Her tiny voice cuts through the storm, asking why this strange man shares her exact facial structure. I have seen time and again that the repressed truth will always hunt us down, no matter how aggressively we compartmentalize it. That single question shatters Lorenzo's psychological defenses. Down in the mud, A shivering puppy crawls toward the unconscious Elena. Marco scowls down the steep bank, yelling that the nearest trauma ward is 20 minutes away. Guards rush forward with a canvas stretcher. Lorenzo raises one hand, his features locked in a mask of absolute control. No hospitals, he snaps. Marco freezes in the downpour, completely stunned by the cold weight of that command. We shift now to the stark paranoia of the criminal mind. Public hospitals require paperwork, and flashing lights expose buried secrets. Lorenzo understands these grim survival mechanics better than any patient I have analyzed. He scoops up the shivering puppy, pressing the tiny animal tight against his soaked coat. If a rival syndicate orchestrated to this trash, he must isolate the bleeding woman from the watchful world. He orders his men summoned to summon their underground physician immediately. Up on the jagged ridge, Dante stands perfectly still, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He observes the chaotic rescue with the detachment of a ghost. There is a clinical essence hiding in his deadened eyes. Silence is never truly empty. It is always choked with the brutal, unspoken traumas we are far too terrified to ever vocalize. Lorenzo marches past Dante, the wet gravel crunching like glass beneath his boots. He orders his subordinates to load the armored vehicles. That 40-minute transport back to the compound plays out like an agonizing funeral march. Historically, those iron gates project the narcissistic arrogance of immense wealth. Tonight, they merely insulate a desperate bunker against the storm. The staff stands waiting in the pale porch light. Lorenzo ignores them entirely. He carries Judas, the unconscious little girl, inside himself, her chin resting on his shoulder. The behavioral psychology teaches us that the heaviest emotional burdens we ever carry are the ones that physically weigh nothing at all. Marco carries Elena up the stone steps, while the traumatized puppy trails closely behind like a hypervigilant shadow. Dr. Hartwell pushes through the doors at 1 in the morning, dripping rainwater onto the marble. He has medicated the syndicate for 2 years. 2 strict 1 rule: do the messy work and suppress your questions. He treats Elena directly on the velvet sofa, assessing her physical trauma. Tense half-hour ticks by before he stands, wiping his glasses. He notes a concussion and cracked ribs, clinically amazed by her biological luck. You and I rarely appreciate the fragile nature of our own survival, our survival, until the threat of death finally walks away. Hartwell mutters that whoever pulled her from the wreckage saved her life. Lorenzo asks about the little girl, an uncharacteristic tremor of anxiety fracturing his cold vocal tone. The doctor sighs, prescribing nothing but quiet rest and the grounding presence of her rescue dog. Our observation shifts to Lorenzo's boots. The rescue puppy has curled into a defensive ball beside Elena, resting his chin against her ankle for emotional regulation. Lorenzo quietly orders the staff to leave the bonded creature alone. Suddenly, slippers echo down the staircase. Lorenzo watches his mother, Isabella, descend in a sweeping black robe. She moves with the calculated grace of a narcissist inspecting a ruined empire. An analytical mind knows that absolute power never rushes blindly toward a crisis. It waits for the panic to bleed itself dry. Isabella opens her mouth to demand answers, but the syllables die in her throat. Her cold eyes lock onto the bruised woman on the cushions. In an instant, undeniable terror strips every drop of color from her aging face, shattering her composed facade entirely. Focus on the micro-expressions of Isabella's hands. She grips the banister until her knuckles fade to a stress-induced white. Her jaw parts, but the room remains silent. Her panic gaze drifts, landing on the small child curled in the armchair. Isabella clutches her throat, swaying like a patient struck by a severe psychological trigger. Lorenzo watches her drown in anxiety, observing every facial twitch with clinical patience. Mother, he murmurs, his voice a slow, dangerous rumble. What have you kept from me? We eventually learn that the truth always casts a suffocating shadow, no matter how much cognitive dirt we throw over it. Isabella stares back, and tears of genuine panic brimming in her eyes, before fleeing into the hallway. Her voice across the buffet, hidden from view, Dante mutters frantically into a burner phone. The boss found her. Dante hisses into the receiver, paranoid anxiety twisting his voice. The timeline dissolves into the sterile hours of early morning. Little Sophia flutters her eyelids open. Watch how she processes this alien environment. She stares up at a grand ceiling. A chandelier scatters harsh shards of light across the room. She blinks, fighting to arrange the jagged cognitive pieces of her nightmare, the roaring rain, the tearing steel. Her mother refusing to wake up, and that tragic man who shared her exact facial symmetry. It is a devastating reality of psychology that a child's mind is fragile, yet perfectly preserves the exact traumas we pray they forget. She sits up with a sharp gasp, rubbing her bruised elbow, experiencing acute disorientation inside a strange, vast, and entirely empty bed. A sudden shift at the mattress edge triggers her startled response. Slowly, Bandit, the survivor puppy, lifts his heavy head. The second their eyes lock, his tail beats a rhythmic drum against the duvet. Bandit, Sophia whispers, her voice breaking under emotional relief. She scrambles across the sheets, burying her face into his neck. He instinctively licks the dried tears from her cheek, leaning his spear-nut head against hers to provide grounding contact. We observe a simple clinical truth here, the most profound Frickion psychological comfort in a shattered world often arrives from gentle, non-verbal souls. They sit frozen in the silent room. Where is Mommy? She murmurs into his fur. The resilient dog hops down to the floor, pausing at the half-open wooden door, waiting to guide her into the dark hallway. Before leaving, she spots a vital grounding object. Her worn, stuffed bear sits on a velvet chair. Someone within this sociopathic household actually took a moment of empathy to tie a fresh silk ribbon around its neck. She squeezes the transitional toy under her arm and steps barefoot into the corridor. To a child's brain, this architectural is terrifying. Cold marble stretches into the shadows, flanked by looming oak doors. Massive oil portraits of unsmiling patriarchs stare down at her. She reaches up, turning the brass handle stem of the first door. There she is. Her mother lies beneath a thick quilt, a white bandage across her pale temple. A private nurse knits quietly in the corner. You and I must admit, sleep is often the only true psychological shield we have left against the agonizing realities of the conscious world. The nurse whispers her mother simply needs the medication to process, promising she will wake up soon. Sophia gives a hyper-vigilant nod before gently clicking the door shut. The tiny girl and her dog resume their ghost-like patrol of the sprawling estate. They find a grand staircase descending like a marble waterfall. She grips the rail, her voice echoing as she counts the steps as a soothing cope-mapping mechanism. 18, 24, 32. Isn't human curiosity a strangely beautiful psychological flaw? It almost always finds a pathway to conquer our paralyzing biological fears. Reaching the bottom floor, she pushes against heavy double doors and completely freezes. The space is a massive, dimly lit library, and sitting right there in a worn leather chair is the violently tragic man possessing her exact blue eyes. Analyze this devastating clinical frame. Lorenzo sits isolated in the gloom, scarred hands wrapped around a mug, staring blankly through the wet glass. He is a subject actively drowning in his own untreated trauma. You and I know the undeniable truth. The heaviest psychological baggage we ever carry is the dark past we refuse to confront. Suddenly, little Sophia breaks the strict boundary of his sanctuary. She asks if this giant house belongs to him, entirely immune to the lethal aura radiating from his posture. Lorenzo jolts in his seat, his hypervigilance failing as coffee sloshes over the rim. Unbothered, she hauls herself into the opposite armchair, letting the dog curl over her toes. "I am 5, she announces with pure authority, demanding his actual name. He murmurs his dark title into the room, and she simply scrunches her nose in playful defiance. Examine the striking behavioral contrast. A child effortlessly bypasses the defense mechanisms of man commanding an empire of violence. So Sophia Lorenzo finds him too complex and renames him Mr. Lowe. This provokes an involuntary chuckle from his dormant emotional center. His psychological temperature plunges, however, when she notes they share the exact same blue eyes, adding her father died before she was born. Innocence acts as a skeleton key, dismantling his sociopathic armor. Upstairs, Elena regains consciousness. Her bruised eyes open to a heavy canopy, unaware that her traumatic past is actively colliding with her fragile present. The clinical truth we must all accept is that our deepest unresolved traumas never truly remain buried forever. You and I are going to unpack the sheer psychological terror of this moment. Reality shatters Elena's dissociative fog with brutal force. Her battered nervous system screams as she forces herself upright into a spinning blur of cream walls and dark oak. The physical trauma is entirely secondary to the cognitive distress gripping her when she registers the portrait above the fireplace. She is a captive inside the estate of her abuser. A primitive maternal panic erupts from her chest, manifesting in a raw scream for her daughter that tears through the silence. Suddenly, the heavy oak door clicks open and Lorenzo steps inside. The harsh lesson we observe in a panic is universal. Your Bulgar completely fails, but your psychological shadows will always hunt you down. Lorenzo occupies the doorway, locked behind the mask of a high-functioning megalomaniac. The silence presses against the room like a physical weight. Elena, the 5 spent cognitively rehearsing this confrontation, building elaborate defense mechanisms. Yet facing him, her mind completely stalls. His measured voice slices the quiet, noting that Sophia is safe downstairs, eating pancakes with the dog. Instantly, Elena's prolonged cortisol spike collapses. Her reaction illustrates a profound behavioral reality about endurance. Carrying a psychological burden of terror will slowly warp your internal architecture, and the sudden absence of that threat leaves you shattered on the floor. The clinical lesson is undeniable. We must recognize that sudden, absolute relief can be just as devastating to the nervous system as chronic fear. Tears trace Elena's face as Lorenzo invades her spatial boundary. His ocular fixation is intense, displaying the exact genetic marker he passed to their daughter. His vocal register drops into a predatory baseline, demanding the reason behind her 5-year disappearance. As we observe in clinical cases, profound shame acts as a weighted anchor, forcing a person's gaze submissively downward. She cannot maintain eye contact while choking out a fractured apology, finally articulating the biological truth of his paternity. Lorenzo closes his eyes, processing this cognitive dissonance like blunt force trauma to Stosenum. The emotional devastation radiating through the space is absolute. The psychological lesson remains stark. Buried secrets will eventually detonate, destroying the mental stability of everyone caught in the immediate blast radius. When Lorenzo's eyes ray open, the constructed facade of the narcissistic boss has dissolved. He exhibits signs of a profound psychological collapse, presenting raw agony. His voice strains as he asks why she deliberately led him believe he was unlovable. Elena states her primary directive was protecting their infant. When he demands to know from what, she delivers a targeted strike. She was protecting the child from his world. She outlines a pathological network of cartels and body bags, refusing to condition her daughter's developing a brain with nocturnal escape routes. It is a harsh clinical reality, yet it provides a critical life lesson. Securing the mental safety of an innocent child must always supersede our own toxic attachments, regardless of the immense personal suffering it causes us. Elena's affection was genuine, but her maternal instinct shifted her focus entirely to the child's survival. Lorenzo clinically accuses her of lacking faith in him. During this interaction, Elena nearly weaponizes the ultimate hidden variable. She almost exposes Silas Kosogol's terrorums and a lethal ultimatums executed by his own mother, Isabella. The truth sits on her tongue, capable of initiating a catastrophic rupture. Instead, she suppresses the explosive data, internalizing the toxic reality. Watching her withdraw, Lorenzo's emotional defense mechanisms instantly reactivate, and he exits in silence. The behavioral lesson here is devastatingly clear. The most destructive psychological burdens we carry are the venomous secrets we willingly metabolize to shield the people we love from deeper trauma. Despite his cognitive dissonance, Lorenzo fails to generate an aggressive response. Stick with me, because you and I are about to examine the neurological fallout when a megalomaniac's defense grid completely fails. Acute emotional trauma physically rewires behavioral pathways. By dawn, functioning on zero sleep, Lorenzo navigates the damp grounds, anchoring himself to a black coffee. The storm has ceased, leaving the estate draped in a haunting mist. Near the water, he observes a bandit resting in a pocket of sunlight. The animal has clearly been bathed and comforted. This presents a critical psychological mechanism for our own survival. Identifying a tiny fraction of innocent tranquility amid catastrophic collapse is often the only thing preventing total mental failure. The canine is sanitized but displays severe caloric deficiency, wearing a medical dressing from the recent extraction. Lorenzo occupies the stone bench, studying the animal. We must contextualize this behavioral anomaly. This is an apex predator in the criminal hierarchy, who spent 37 years suppressing his empathy beneath calculated violence. Yet now, his emotional regulation is failing over a creature with a negligible physical mass. He vocalizes a low tone, prompting a twitch from the subject. With restricted vocal cords, Lorenzo admits that without this animal intercepting his vehicle, his familial unit would have remained undetected. The clinical conclusion is profound. Life frequently deploys the most statistically improbable catalysts to entirely restructure our psychological trajectory. Lorenzo directs a rhetorical inquiry to the animal. The canine elevates its head, projecting a gaze of deep cognitive awareness. It establishes visual contact with the boss, wobbles across the terrain, and applies its cold nose to Lorenzo's trembling hand. The patriarch secures his scarred fingers around the creature, verbalizing a fractured expression of gratitude. This quiet moment is abruptly terminated by juvenile footsteps. Sophia sprints across the lawn, enveloped in an oversized sweater. Her cheeks are flushed from the cold as she displays a chocolate confection. She decelerates rapidly, requesting permission to administer a reward to the dog. The therapeutic takeaway is essential. Actively demonstrating if we don't is a fundamental stability of emotional recovery. The child outlines her parameters, noting the chef approved the treat. Lorenzo executes a non-verbal confirmation, analytically aware that speaking would trigger an emotional collapse. Sophia segments the confection, offering a tiny fraction on her palm. The canine extracts it with extreme precision. This interaction generates a spontaneous laugh from the girl, effectively neutralizing the depressive atmosphere of the estate. She assumes a grounded posture adjacent to his heavy fare, providing tactile stimulation to the dog. She narrates the animal's origin as a gift from Wisconsin, noting its initially microscopic size. The psychological reinforcement here is critical. Consistent, small applications of daily nurturing behavior will inevitably construct the most resilient emotional bonds you will ever witness. Sophia uses a space gesture to show the dog's original dimensions. She explains the need and for bottled baby feeding and shares mother's psychological. This animal was deployed for her security. She confidently assesses the dog's operational efficiency to the crime boss. Lorenzo experiences acute physiological constriction in his throat. He studies this scrawny organism that braved fire and glass to reintegrate a fractured family. He vocalizes a quiet agreement regarding its efficacy. Later, from a balcony, Lorenzo watches his daughter playing with the canine. The previously sterile environment is now saturated with authentic joy. Let us examine this fundamental truth together. The family unit is the paramount behavioral structure, and defending its integrity is our ultimate purpose. For the first time in years, the estate ceases to function as an isolation chamber. The cyclical pattern of pathological grief is fracturing. This cognitive shift is interrupted by Dante, his conditioned enforcer. Dante advises extreme operational hypervigilance. He notes that the mother and child during an active turf war is a statistical anomaly, suggesting a psychological ambush. Lorenzo maintains absolute ocular stillness. Without raising his volume, he coldly instructs his subordinate to terminate his verbal output. The atmospheric tension instantly plummets. The behavioral diagnostic is completely clear. To successfully cultivate fragile new emotional growth, you must forcefully silence the toxic, paranoid voices within your immediate radius. In this pivotal moment, profound human attachment finally neutralizes a lifetime of chronic paranoia. Picture Isabella, the iron-fisted matriarch, experiencing what we call a narcissistic collapse. She barricades herself inside her estate, letting her son assume she is merely exhausted. But severe cognitive dissonance is tearing her psyche apart. She is haunted by the image of a little girl clinging to a one-eyed teddy bear. That child is her own blood. A granddaughter she clinically excised from her life for life. For years, Isabella earnestly robbed herself of some choosing the delusion of absolute control over connection. It perfectly illustrates a painful psychological reality. The absolute worst prisons we will ever endure are the ones we construct with our own defense mechanisms. By the third day of this suffocating confinement, she forces herself out into the quiet chill of her private rose garden. The garden functions as a haunting shrine of withered roses, the pathological tribute to Isabella's late husband. She sits beneath the pale pergola, paralyzed in the autumn chill, accepting the freezing wind as a self-imposed penalty. We learn the hard way that the bitterest cold does not come from the winter air, but from the crushing weight of our own destructive choices. Suddenly, the gravel crunches. There stands little Sophia, wrapped in a faded pink coat with mismatched buttons, dragging a worn, stuffed bear. She fixes her fearless eyes on the matriarch. "Hello," the child says, completely untroubled by the shadow of the criminal syndicate. Isabella forgets how to breathe, managing only a broken whisper in return as the brave little girl takes a careful step closer, immune to the woman's dark aura. Sophia stops a few feet away, studying the older woman with the brutal, unclouded observation only a child possesses. "Why do you keep looking at me and then crying?" the girl asks. Isabella tries to answer, but her verbal processing simply shuts down. "I want you to examine this dynamic with me. Here sits an underworld queen who commands politicians through sheer terror, yet all that bloody armor crumbles before unregulated innocence. It reminds us of a quiet truth. Intimidation is a fragile illusion when faced with simple honesty." Finding the matriarch paralyzed, Sophia takes action. She climbs onto the creaking wooden bench, settling her stuffed bear.
"My mommy says when you feel sad, you should get a hug,"
she announces gently, fundamentally rewiring the hostility of the entire environment. "Do you want me to give you a hug?" It is a simple question, yet it shatters the sociopathic fortress Isabella spent decades building. The Iron Lady experiences a complete emotional rupture. She lets out a raw gasp, a ragged sound she has suppressed since her husband died. She pulls the little girl into her shaking arms, subconsciously trying to piece her fragmented psyche back together. The beautiful tragedy is that Sophia hugs her right back without hesitation. Those tiny arms wrap tightly around the old woman's neck. In this tear-sainted minute, we observe a profound reality. True forgiveness does not always require an articulated apology. Sometimes, it just takes an open heart. Eventually, Sophia pulls back and begins to chat, unaware of the devastating psychological weight her next words will carry. Sophia murmurs about their old apartment, recalling how her mother would cry in the dark. "I asked why she was sad, and Mommy told me about a mother who loved her son so much that she chased everyone else away." Away, the child explains. Mommy said she was not bad, just sad. We must analyze the sheer resilience of this. For 5 brutal years, Elena raised a child alone under the agonizing stress of Mafia threats. Yet, she refused to infect her daughter to develop a brain with a single drop of hate. Choosing grace over toxic bitterness is truly the highest form of psychological strength. Hearing this quiet revelation, Isabella loses all composure. The fierce boss buries her weeping face deep into Sophia's hair, desperately masking her total nervous breakdown from this emotionally grounded child. By 11 at night, the mansion falls into clinical silence. Sophia is gently patting Isabella's back, regulating the older woman's nervous system. "Everybody cries sometimes," the child whispers, dismantling the matriarch's pathological defenses. But across the room, a different psychological storm is brewing. Lorenzo is done playing games. Throughout dinner, he hyper-analyzed his mother's micro-expressions. He noted her inability to meet his wife's eyes, the violent tremor in her hand. The behavioral data finally clicks. When his wounded wife was brought home, showed no shock, only the grim recognition of a perpetrator viewing their own handiwork. It is a chilling reminder of a harsh truth. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies we face sit right across from us at our own dinner table. The house plunges into darkness. Elena and the child sleep safely upstairs, but Lorenzo remains in a state of high physiological arousal. He marches to his mother's room. One sharp knock. He demands she follow him to his study. They enter the office, lit only by a dying fire. He pours himself a whiskey, deliberately leaving her empty-handed to assert dominance. She sits in the leather chair, attempting to rebuild her familiar armor of narcissistic pride. Lorenzo simply glares at the woman who raised him. True betrayal permanently alters our cognitive mapping of a person, stripping away all shared history. He is no longer looking at his mother. He is diagnosing a dangerous, malignant traitor. Mother, he warns, his tone dropping to a predatory frequency. What did you do to Elena 5 years ago? Demands. The psychological prayer in the room grows suffocatingly dense. Isabella remains mute, her eyes locked on the floor in a rare display of submission. Do not make me ask twice, he snaps. In that moment, the Iron Lady structurally fails. Her shoulders tremble violently, tears falling as she buries her face in her hands. I threatened her, she finally confesses. She admits telling Elena that if she did not vanish, the syndicate would destroy her loved ones with fabricated charges. It is frightening to analyze the terrible acts megalomaniacs will justify in the name of loyalty. We learn a hard clinical here. Real love empowers those we care about, while toxic protection only brings ruthless cruelty to the innocent. I said all of those terrible things, she weeps. The camera catches the exact microsecond Lorenzo's motor functions freeze. I gave her 500,000 as Isabella chokes out, revealing the crude financial mechanics of her manipulation. I told her she would never be anything but trash to our empire. The emotional explosion is violently sudden. Lorenzo slams his fist into the mahogany desk. The bottle crashes onto the marble floor, filling the air with the stringent of liquor. Do you have any earthly idea what you took from me? He roars. My wife, my daughter, 5 entire years. The psychological weight of this betrayal hits the nervous system. We eventually learn this brutal truth. Time is the single currency you can never earn back. Stolen time leaves a human soul bankrupt. Mother, he roars. Lorenzo strictly regulates his emotions, but tonight, 5 years of repressed trauma break loose. She raised our child alone in an apartment I could have bought in cash. Sophia grew up thinking her father was dead. He stares down at her, his psychological framework destroyed. I self-medicated into darkness every night, believing I chased away the only woman I loved. And it was your fault. The camera follows Isabella as she crumbles. The untouchable queen of the underworld now kneels in a degraded puddle of whiskey and shattered glass. I thought she was just a gold digger, she whispers, clinging to her shattered prejudice. It is a devastating clinical picture that teaches a bitter lesson. Operating from a place of blind narcissistic arrogance will cost you everything you love. I have been wrong every single day, she sobs, finally crushed by her own hubris. The camera focuses on Lorenzo, experiencing such profound psychological disgust that he cannot stomach the sight of her. He turns, marches out, and kicks open the doors into the freezing Chicago night. He stands barefoot on the icy grass. Under the moonlight, the feared syndicate boss breaks down in tears for the first time since the boyhood. His rescue dog, Bandit, quietly walks up and rests a heavy head against his shaking leg. It demonstrates a simple behavioral truth. Animals intuitively detect when a human nervous system is completely shattered. But we must cut away because the danger is far from over. Miles away, tucked inside a decaying meatpacking plant, 2 blacked-out cars sit idle. The relentless, sociopathic cycle of violence is about to spin again. Let us pause and analyze the clinical framing of this sequence together. We drop into a freezing warehouse in the dead of night, a freight train screaming like a mechanical distress signal. Dante stands across from the rival boss, Salvatore Vanzetti's. Sal wears a classic sociopathic facade, flashing heavy gold rings and a bright-eyed superficial smile that has lured countless men to an early grave. Sal asks if Lorenzo, the untouchable titan, has finally gone soft. Dante shakes his head, delivering a brilliantly accurate psychological assessment. He replies that Lorenzo has not gone soft. He has gone human, which makes him infinitely more dangerous. It highlights the intimate trying to pie issue of their criminal ecosystem. The very second you drop your defense mechanisms to genuinely love someone, you place a massive target directly on your own back. Let us open this case file together and examine the pathology at play. Dante presents a severe psychological trigger to the rival patriarch Sal. Elena Russo is alive, hiding at Lorenzo's compound with a 5-year-old biological heir. I have analyzed men like Sal in maximum security wards. We clinically classify this as the dark calculation of a megalomaniac narcissist identifying a fatal vulnerability. Dante struck metal table, a physical manifestation of unhealed trauma. For 2 decades, he has hunted for a fracture in Lorenzo's defenses, driven by the memory of his father absorbing a bullet for the old kingpin. The diagnostic takeaway is deeply unsettling. Ingrained vengeance does not heal a broken mind. It systematically devours the host's psyche from the inside out. We must analyze the environmental roots of this behavioral disorder. The subject's cognitive framework was shattered at 14. The syndicate elders declared his father a hero, yet isolated the boy in a freezing apartment to traffic illegal weaponry. We observe a stark contrast. Lorenzo was conditioned in an opulent estate to inherit an empire. For 20 years, Dante exhibited absolute compliance, presenting an adaptive facade. The former patriarch operated under the delusion of conditioning a loyal enforcer, oblivious to the sociopathic resentment incubating within his walls. The clinical lesson is absolute. When an authority figure demands total subjugation while inflicting profound psychological neglect, they do not secure a stable legacy. They meticulously engineer their own assassin. Observe the physiological response of the subject in this environment. When Dante vocalizes the title of boss toward Lorenzo, a visceral somatic symptom manifests in his abdomen. His father became collateral damage to elevate the dynasty, and Dante is compelled to balance this psychological ledger. Across the sector,
Sal exhales smoke with the chilling affect of apex predator. He clinically assesses Dante, recognizing operative burden, emotional confusion.
the transaction is merciless. Sal requires the termination of Lorenzo, Elena, and their offspring to secure a harbor. You and I must recognize the behavioral pattern here. Unchecked pathological greed consistently blinds powerful megalomaniacs to the highly unstable monsters they actively cultivate in the shadows. An iron handshake finalizes this sociopathic agreement. Dante exhibits a terrifying baseline stillness, a hallmark of antisocial adaptation. He recognizes that Lorenzo is consumed by acute clinical paranoia. Yet, Dante understands the structural flaws of the human psyche. Every psychological fortress contains a latent fracture. He simply waits for Lorenzo to break his rigid routine. In the shadows, Dante processes 20 years of repressed hostility. It is a terrifying psychiatric reality we must confront. Pathological revenge is an uncontrollable cognitive wildfire. It will willingly incinerate the subject's own foundation just to eradicate a single perceived threat. We then observe Lorenzo, physically weighted by severe depression, dragging himself up the stairs to confront Elena. Let us step into this room and deconstruct the emotional fallout together. A book drops from Elena's hands as Lorenzo enters, his affect completely blunted. The systemic deception has collapsed. He clinically states his mother confessed to the psychological blackmail that forced Elena into exile. As her posture breaks into severe distress, Lorenzo exhibits no aggressive volatility, only profound depressive sorrow. He sits on the mattress, maintaining a rigid spatial boundary. He speaks with deliberateness, fearful that physical contact might trigger a trauma's response, assuring her she no longer bears this burden alone. Harboring a toxic secret creates catastrophic internal pressure, but articulating the objective truth remains the only valid mechanism for psychological release. Elena's defense mechanisms totally disintegrate. Her vocal tone fragments as she details the psychological poison she internalized for 5 years. We must view her behavior through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome. She sacrificed her autonomy, complying with a hostile matriarch to protect Lorenzo's emotional equilibrium. She admits she concealed the truth, so he would not irrevocably sever ties with his own bloodline. The cognitive dissonance strikes him instantly. She nurtured their offspring in urban poverty, absorbing the trauma alone, while he medicated his depressive episodes in an opulent fortress. Healthy psychological attachment is rarely a grandiose display. It manifests in the clinical, silent self-erasure required to shield the subjects we value most. Lorenzo visibly processes the severe cognitive impact of missing his child's developmental milestones. The repressed grief of Elena's isolation finally ruptures. She admits a persistent emotional attachment, overridden only by the maternal instinct to prevent their daughter from becoming a syndicate target. Experiencing a sudden peak independency, Lorenzo breaks the spell's barrier, drawing her in as her physical tension entirely collapses. After a period of somatic regulation, he guides her to the balcony, actively preparing to terminate his antisocial behavioral loop. We exhaust immense cognitive resources, constructing defensive mental barriers, but the ultimate clinical breakthrough is simply dismantling the ego and accepting genuine affection. Under the moonlight, Lorenzo initiates a radical paradigm shift. Gripping her hand to anchor his nervous system, he declares his withdrawal from the syndicate. Experiencing severe psychological burnout, he outlines an extraction protocol, fully aware that defecting triggers execution order. He notes that upon establishing contact with his daughter, his sociopathic persona entirely ceased functioning. Elena's pupils dilate with panic, accurately assessing that criminal leaders do not simply transition to civilian life. Yet, Lorenzo finally exhibits a primary biological drive for self-preservation. Authentic prosocial bonding fundamentally rewires neural pathways. It dismantles our maladaptive defense mechanisms, leaving the psyche exposed but fully awake to objective reality. Observe the subject's kinesics. Lorenzo actively resists his baseline avoidant behaviors, committing to preserve the psychological reset. As they embrace, years of chronic hyperarousal slowly dissipate. We observe their daughter and her juvenile canine providing a crucial stimulus of domestic stability. However, sustained equilibrium in this environment is merely a cognitive distortion. At sunrise, severe external stress shatters the compound. The canine initiates a frantic vocalization, a primitive alarm that violently pulls Lorenzo from his sleep cycle. This is a psychiatric paradox you and I frequently observe in these case files. The exact millisecond a subject deactivates this hypervigilance to experience safety is precisely when the highest probability of trauma occurs. Lorenzo's accelerates to the perimeter, finding the canine displaying extreme territorial aggression, processing stimuli beyond human sensory thresholds. Inside, Elena demonstrates an immediate trauma response, extracting Sophia from all sight lines. Lorenzo enters the security hub, pupils dilated with adrenaline, demanding the surveillance feed. At 3:37 in the morning, an unidentified hostile meticulously maps the boundary. The subject halts, making direct eye contact with the lens before dissolving into the tree line. Lorenzo experiences a catastrophic stress response. We classify this as a systematic vulnerability assessment. Authentic lethality does not announce itself with explosive entry. It clinically observes your psychological patterns and patiently incubates in the shadows. The atmosphere in the control room is suffocating as they analyze the archived data. The empirical results are alarming, revealing 2 prior visual confirmations. This predator is executing a methodical spatial analysis, quantifying guard rotations and identifying blind spots. This clearly indicates a highly regulated contract killer. Transitioning into severe acute stress, Lorenzo radically escalates perimeter security and deploys armed assets near his family. When he re-enters the courtyard, the canine's biological alarm has deactivated. However, acute clinical paranoia has permanently rewired Lorenzo's nervous system. Constructing impenetrable physical barriers only mitigates external visible threats. It never insulates the psyche from the lethal anomalies already occupying your environment. Inside, the canine remains hyperfixated on the access route. A juvenile mammal identified a lethal stimulus that sophisticated technology failed to register. Lorenzo physically grounds the trembling animal. As the day progresses, the family initiates a severe dissociative coping mechanism. They engage in a macabre theatrical performance of normalcy to mask the impending assassination threat. Sophia pulls her father into the library, while Elena navigates a toxic interaction with the matriarch. The older woman's motor skills fail, burdened by the immense psychological guilt of fracturing their family unit. Chronic remorse is a devastating cognitive load, and authentic psychological reconciliation is a volatile process that frequently requires an entire lifetime to safely navigate. Let us open this case file together. Lorenzo carries his daughter across the foyer, blind to the apex predator stepping into his home. Dante plays the brother flawlessly, his relaxed smile a textbook display of sociopathic mirroring. Yet the puppy, driven by primitive threat detection, sees past the mask. The animal freezes, a guttural warning rumbling from his chest. Dantes to deflect with her hollow laugh, but the dog physically blocks the child, baring his teeth. Lorenzo catalogues every micro-expression of this hostility, remaining silent as he pulls his daughter away.
The clinical takeaway is profound. Always trust the unfiltered instincts of the innocent.
They inherently sense the dangerous predators we so blindly invite into our own safe spaces. As midnight approaches, the estate plunges into darkness, carrying the heavy weight of impending trauma. The puppy rejects his bed, flattening his trembling body across the bedroom threshold. His hypervigilant ears track every shifting floorboard. Elena watches from the shadows, asking what the animal senses in the void. Lorenzo stands in the dim light like a kingpin crushed beneath his own crumbling empire. He murmurs hollow promises of armed mercenaries. Yet, kneeling on the hardwood, he admits this stray provides a better psychological shield than any hired killer. This highlights a profound cognitive distortion. We constantly confuse a financial transaction with actual value. You can easily buy a man's physical presence, but genuine devotion is only ever earned through unconditional love. The puppy wears a euthanasia watch, the eyes locked on the creeping shadows. By late afternoon, the psychological illusion of safety completely shatters. Marco has engaged in obsessive data analysis for 2 days, hunting for a systemic anomaly. Finally, he isolates the pathology. Buried in the digital forensics sits a single call from the East Wing, tracing straight to a shell corporation. You and I are going to unpack this tragedy together, but ask yourself how they missed the behavioral red flags. This brings us to a bitter, clinical reality regarding human vulnerability. The most devastating psychological trauma never comes from the loud rivals we keep at a safe distance. The fatal knife in your back is almost always held by the covert narcissist you invited to sit at your very own dinner table. Belongs to Dante, the parasitic sociopath who, for decades, experiencing an acute stress response. Marco grabs the radio, his vocal cords tightening as he contacts Lorenzo. He begs the leader to return, finally forcing the horrific truth into the open. It is Dante. The connection terminates. Triggered into a sympathetic nervous response, Lorenzo buries the accelerator. His truck flies down the asphalt, his nail against the wheel. He is a man watching his entire cognitive framework completely collapse. This reminds us of dark behavioral truth. The most fatal psychological wounds rarely come from external threats. They are struck by the chosen brothers we blindly trusted to guard our vulnerabilities. Lorenzo crushes his phone, dialing the estate in a compulsive loop. He receives nothing but an agonizing ring. When his tires tear onto the driveway, his core fears take physical shape. The iron gates swing aimlessly, stripped of their purpose. He abandons the vehicle before the engine stops. The opulent foyer VA is now a clinical graveyard of shattered porcelain. A single pink slipper lies isolated on the cold marble. Two guards slump against the wall, chemically neutralized. Lorenzo screams his wife's name, emitting a primal vocalization of grief that tears his own throat. This demonstrates how terrifyingly fragile our baseline reality truly is. In the space of a single heartbeat, the human attachments anchoring our entire psychological stability can simply vanish into the quiet shadows. He searches the sprawling halls, his boots echoing like a frantic heartbeat. The library is vacant. In the kitchen, a cup of tea sits undisturbed and cold. Unit has been systematically erased. His respiratory rate spikes as he stumbles into the entryway where a miserable sound breaks the silence. He drops to his knees. Tucked against the wall is the puppy. The animal is hemorrhaging, his leg fractured at a grotesque angle. The psychopathic intruders simply discarded the dog like inanimate garbage. This forces us to confront a dark, diagnostic reflection of pathology. You can accurately measure subjects' moral deficiency by observing how they treat the vulnerable. The ultimate manifestation of cowardice is inflicting trauma upon those incapable of defense. Despite massive physiological shock, the dog exhibited an immense survival drive. He dragged his broken weight across the floor to reach his protector. Locked in his jaws is a torn strip of black wool, a direct forensic link to Dante's coat. Lorenzo processes this data and unleashes a guttural noise that defies clinical categorization. It is the uninhibited roar of a wounded apex predator. He flips a heavy oak table and drives his bare fist through a glass mirror, shattering his own reflection. While this appears to be a chaotic display of pure destruction, it reveals a universal psychiatric truth. Explosive anger is almost always a rigid psychological defense mechanism, masking devastating sorrow. Clinical grief is merely a profound love that suddenly has nowhere to go. Blood drips from his lacerated knuckles, but acute dissociation blocks the pain. A vibration shatters the silence. The screen displays Dante's name. Lorenzo answers in absolute, chilling silence. The voice instructs him to arrive at Pier 14 by midnight, alone to negotiate his family's survival. Lorenzo terminates connection without granting his tormentor a single syllable of validation. This sudden emotional flatline is far more terrifying than his previous rage. He sinks onto the floor, pulling the shivering dog against his chest to apply pressure to the hemorrhage, whispering that the animal fought with true integrity. It serves as a vivid clinical example of courage. Real bravery requires no external armor. Sometimes, the most resilient psychological fortitude beats quietly inside the smallest frames. The dog shivers violently from shock, yet musters the neurological drive to weakly lick the crime boss's face. A physician arrives, rushing the animal away for stabilization. Meanwhile, Lorenzo descends into the fortified basement. He flattens a map of the waterfront across a table, summoning exactly 12 operatives. These are isolated assets who never formed a parasocial bond with Dante. There is zero margin for divided attachments. Stick with me here, because you and I need to clinically observe what happens when a dominant personality is backed into a corner. He strips away all emotional variables until only iron remains. True loyalty is a rare behavioral metric. Unbreakable trust is never grown in times of easy peace. It is only ever forged inside the crushing psychological heat of shared trauma. The basement atmosphere sits heavy with the neurochemical promise of violence. Lorenzo addresses his strike team with a chillingly flat effect. Syndicate protocols are completely suspended. Dante nurtured his psychopathic vengeance for decades, but Lorenzo will terminate him before sunrise. He taps Warehouse 14 on the map, stating he will walk through those doors exactly as instructed. By presenting as a solitary target, he will trigger Dante's arrogance. Yet, he orders 12 concealed rifles positioned in the surrounding blind spots. This tactical gamble reveals a profound clinical truth about the psychological burden of leadership. There are crucial moments when you cannot hide behind a group's defensive structure. Sometimes you must walk into the terrifying darkness entirely alone, just to ensure the survival of those you love. The operatives equip tactical gear to blend into the night. Lorenzo mandates absolute radio silence. The operation hinges on a single, non-verbal behavioral cue. The moment his coat drops, the lethal engagement begins. He locks eyes with the team, his tone like freezing water. If anyone breaks protocol prematurely, his family becomes collateral damage. Before departing, Lorenzo visits the heavily medicated puppy. The instant the door creaks, the animal attempts to force his broken body upright, his primitive drive demanding he protect his alpha. Lorenzo gently applies pressure, keeping him safely on the mattress. This interaction carries a heavy diagnostic truth. Genuine attachment is not always about physical proximity. Real love often dictates forcing the ones you cherish to remain safely behind while you step forward to absorb the trauma. The dog releases a trembling whine, his nervous finale system surrendering to the sedatives. Lorenzo rests his forehead against the animal, whispering a cold promise to balance the behavioral ledger. As he leaves, a primitive howl echoes behind him. Miles away, the clinical reality is grim. Inside a rusting warehouse, Elena is restrained to a concrete pillar. Her older daughter exhibits a fierce trauma response, masking her terror while little Sophia buries her face into her mother's side, seeking a psychological shield. We see this violent generational pathology repeat time and time again. I want you to analyze this moment as we watch the coming chaos unfold together. It represents a human constant for the most innocent minds are always forced to process the heaviest psychological trauma for the unspoken sins of their predecessors. Let us step into this holding room together and observe the power dynamic. Salvatore struts in with the unbearable smugness of a classic megalomaniac narcissist. Entirely convinced he controls the board, he attempts to weaponize Isabella's age, probing for psychological frailty. She never breaks. With a voice like freezing iron, she reminds him she has buried far more dangerous psychopaths, instantly shattering his grandiosity. By the rusted door, Dante stands still, a hollow vessel waiting for Lorenzo. Elena presses her bruised cheek against little Sophia's hair, whispering a quiet promise of rescue. No matter how deeply the darkness tries to bury the human spirit, we must never surrender our hope. Sometimes that quiet belief is the only light we have left when logic fails us. In the terrifying gloom, little Sophia displays an absolute mastery of her own fear. She offers a fierce nod, her bright blue eyes glowing with a certainty that defies her young age. Cut to midnight. The heavy rain pours down as Lorenzo pulls his black sedan up to the towering warehouse gates. For a fleeting second, the bitter cold triggers a trauma response, dragging him back to the shattered late world he once was. But he rejects that psychological ghost. Tonight is about reclaiming his family. Notice this crucial detail. He walks through those massive steel doors without a single weapon, stepping into a den of violent sociopaths with empty hands, armed only with the desperate need to protect your blood, is the purest form of human courage you will ever witness. Let us examine the spatial psychology here. Under harsh industrial lights, Salvatore Weed holds the center, walled by 30 armed enforcers. Dante lingers over his shoulder, a living monument to betrayal. By the raw concrete wall, the hostages are bruised but breathing. Lorenzo meets his daughter's terrified eyes for one devastating second. He suppresses his own sheer panic, projecting a terrifying clinical stillness. Dante barks across the floor, mocking his former brother for coming alone. Lorenzo keeps a steady pace, stating he kept his word. Dante raises his heavy gun. We can never truly outrun our psychological baggage. You have to face your darkest history head on if you ever hope to finally breathe the clear air of a better tomorrow. Dante unleashes vicious insults to assert dominance. He snarls that 5 years ago, Lorenzo would have slaughtered everyone here without a thought. Love, Dante spits, has eroded his psychological armor. Lorenzo stands completely still. He replies that Dante spent 20 years feeding a poisoned obsession, while he wasted 5 lives, and grieving a life he should have defended. They were both fools, Lorenzo states, but his delusional days are done. A micro-expression of guilt crosses Dante's face before he levels his pistol. Lorenzo simply grabs the collar of his thick coat, letting the heavy wool drop to the wet concrete. When diplomacy fails to fix a broken reality, taking bold, decisive action is the absolute only way to save what truly matters in this life. Watch closely with me now, because the behavioral dynamic of the room flips in a single heartbeat. A lethal red laser paints the chest of Salvatore's biggest enforcer, dropping him instantly. A flash from the high rafters ends the hidden sniper. Then Marco and his tactical team violently breached the giant side doors. 12 men flood the floor with terrifying precision, their rifles tearing the silence to shreds. Thick concrete dust chokes the air as the bullets bounce off steel crates. But look at Salvatore's reaction. Stripped of his narcissistic supply and dominant power, he shows his absolute cowardice by turning his gun directly toward the bound women. We always find out exactly who a person really is when their back is finally pushed against a cold, unforgiving wall. Piercing the gunfire, Sophia releases a terrified scream. Elena reacts on primal maternal instinct, throwing her body over her daughter. But notice the older woman. For the past hour, Isabella has quietly shredded her bindings against a jagged metal edge. Now, those blood-soaked ropes finally snap. The matriarch rips her raw hands free and launches herself across the concrete with impossible speed. She forms a human shield over them, just as the cornered narcissist pulls his trigger. Two deafening cracks shatter the space. Isabella takes 2 heavy rounds straight to her chest, but she only tightens her fierce embrace as she violently collapses. A true mother will always gladly pay the highest price to ensure her family remains entirely safe from the world's unrelenting darkness. A guttural roar rips from Lorenzo's throat. It is the raw sound of a man watching his psychological anchor collapse. He snaps his pistol up and fires 3 flawless rounds. The rival narcissist is a lifeless corpse before he even hit the wet concrete. Instantly, the warehouse is swallowed by a suffocating silence. Dane realizes his terrible miscalculation and tries to vanish, but Marco blocks his path with a raised rifle. Lorenzo sprints across the room, sliding painfully to his knees. His hands tremble violently as he gathers his bleeding mother from the freezing floor. Watching this rigidly controlled man completely shatter into pieces is devastating. We rarely grasp the precious weight of the people we love until we are holding them as they fade into the dark. Lorenzo begs his mother to stay, his commanding voice cracking under the crushing trauma. Isabella opens her eyes, offering a strangely peaceful smile that strips away decades of hardened survivalism. Reaching out with a trembling hand, she touches Elena. Isabella softly confesses her past judgment was entirely wrong. She calls Elena the greatest blessing to heal their bleeding family, begging for a pardon. Elena simply weeps, insisting there is nothing to forgive. Choking on unfamiliar tears, Lorenzo tells his mother how deeply he loves her. Her dying request is simple. She demands he abandon this poisonous underworld to nurture a real family. Holding on to toxic anger only rots the human soul. Offering true forgiveness is the absolute only path to finding lasting peace. Isabella instructs them to stop letting her past failures poison their future. She shifts her fading gaze to little Sophia, who stands frozen in shock. Gathering her last fraction of strength, the dying woman rests a trembling hand against the child's cheek. She whispers for her granddaughter to be brave, remain kind, and embody the light that she herself was too frightened to hold. With those quiet words, the matriarch slips away. The bloody warehouse goes entirely still. Lorenzo, a boss who has suppressed his emotions for 30 years, collapses over his mother's chest. He openly weeps before his soldiers, abandoning his iron sun facade. Surrendering to that crushing grief is never a sign of weakness. It is the definitive proof that you truly loved someone with all your heart. Let us examine this next interaction together. It exposes the darkest corners of human trauma. Marco emerges from the smoke, shoving his rifle into Dante's spine. The traitor is bound, blood dripping from his skull. He is forced to his knees beside Isabella's body.
Lorenzo rises from the concrete so slowly that the air feels dangerously thin, towering over his former brother.
Yet Dante exhibits classic sociopathic detachment, showing zero remorse. His bruised face contorts with spite. He screams that his own father bled out on a cold floor exactly like this, dying to protect Lorenzo's empire. Dante is entirely consumed by his blind trauma bond. It is a profound tragedy how the violent seeds our parents plant can easily bloom into our own toxic obsessions. Tears are spilled down Dante's face as he screams about receiving pity, while Lorenzo inherited an empire. Lorenzo stares him down, his psychological state terrifyingly flat. He clinically explains that Dante's father sacrificed his life out of genuine honor, but Dante twisted that gift into pure venom. That toxic baggage belongs to Dante alone. Squeezing his eyes shut, Dante braces himself, expecting a fatal bullet. But the execution never comes. Instead, Lorenzo simply turns his back. He orders Marco to phone Detective Reyes and hand over the surviving syndicate on a silver plate. He walks away, leaving his old friend to rot in a concrete cell. Breaking a cycle of violence demands immense mental fortitude. Walking away from revenge is the ultimate mark of a truly liberated man. Lorenzo stares down at Dante, his voice dropping to a clinical growl. "You wanted my life," he whispers. "Now sit in a cell and feel what true psychological emptiness is." Dante tries to speak, but a fragile voice slices through the tension. "Daddy." Lorenzo freezes. Sophia stands near the rusted doors, shaking in the rain. Tears pour down her cheeks as she reaches out for her father. She had never called him that before. In that single second, every ounce of Lorenzo's trauma and need for payback completely evaporates. He rushes across the floor, crashes to his knees, and pulls his weeping family into a fierce, protective embrace. We often convince ourselves that executing revenge makes us tough. Yet, true strength is dropping your anger entirely to shelter the people who actually need you. In criminal behavioral analysis, we rarely see a subject willingly dismantle their own power structure. Escaping a violent pathology is statistically improbable. Let us examine the subject since after that brutal Chicago storm, an event that acted as a psychological reset. The iron gates of the Moretti estate, fortified for 2 generations of bloodshed, are now wide open. This presents a fascinating behavioral anomaly. Lorenzo, conditioned to answer threats with lethal force, stands before his enforcers and offers them a funded, clean exit. He is actively deprogramming his own syndicate. You and I must look closely at this, because it reveals a profound clinical truth. Any human possesses the psychological capacity to rewrite a dark legacy, provided they have the raw, terrifying courage mage to step out of their self-made shadows. Lorenzo systematically deconstructed his empire with the cold precision of a surgeon. He commanded his soldiers to abandon the Moretti identity entirely, severing their psychological dependence on the syndicate. The underground armories were converted into mundane filing rooms. He willingly hemorrhaged millions of dollars and his terrifying street reputation to purchase domestic stability, showing zero micro-expressions of regret. The clinical lesson here is undeniable. Authentic power is never the ability to induce terror. It is the cognitive mastery to lay down your weapons to shield those you love. Now, the once fortified compound is simply a home. Little Sophia sprints across the lawn in a bright yellow dress, laughing loudly as a massive German shepherd playfully chases her. Observe the canine bandit. His physical rehabilitation mirrors the family's psychological recovery, the pronounced limp from his trauma having vanished entirely. He displays a healthy protective instinct guarding the little girl. But let us direct our clinical focus to the rose garden where the true emotional processing occurs. The deceased matriarch, Isabella, exhibited an obsessive fixation on cultivating a rare yellow rose. When Elena discovered her notes, she made a fascinating psychological pivot. Instead of harboring justified resentment, she adopted the project. The therapeutic takeaway is vital. Authentic healing requires us to selectively nurture the positive fragments that deeply flawed individuals leave behind in our lives. With steady hands, Elena carefully laces the yellow cutter's greetings right at the base of Isabella's heavy marble headstone. The headstone acts as a permanent psychological record, documenting a woman who only developed empathic capacity in her terminal phase. Nearby, Lorenzo approaches, handing a warm coffee to Elena. Their relaxed body language indicates successfully processed trauma. As they watch their daughter, Lorenzo exhibits a moment of cognitive dissonance. He verbalizes his confusion over why he stopped his vehicle that freezing night to rescue a dying animal. His conditioned hypervigilance dictated he remain in the shadows. It was a tactical failure, yet he bypassed his own programming anyway. This teaches us a crucial principle. The most radical shifts in our personal evolution often stem from impulsive, compassionate choices that defy all logical analysis. Elena simply offers a soft, knowing smile, her eyes locked on the bright roses. Elena articulates a profound psychological reality, noting that the subconscious consistently identifies our emotional deficits long before the rational cortex processes them. Lorenzo's suppressed empathy recognized the necessity of that rescue, even as his paranoid defenses fought the impulse. Apply this diagnostic truth to your own life. Trust your visceral intuition, because over-reliance on cold logic often blinds you to your own salvation. The quiet shatters as Sophia races over, demanding another puppy for her dog. An uncalculated, booming laugh is the definitive auditory proof of a ruthless enforcer completely shedding his defensive armor to embrace paternity. They sit together on the stone steps by the water, watching the sun bathe on a completely rehabilitated family unit. The animal stretches across their feet, his nervous system finally downregulated into a state of absolute security. From a clinical perspective, it is fascinating how effective therapeutic interventions arrive in unlikely forms. That freezing canine acted as a catalyst pulling a criminal dynamic back from the precipice of sociopathy. It is empirical proof that authentic attachment can penetrate the darkest behavioral conditioning. Every human subject faces severe psychological testing. We all commit catastrophic errors, allowing narcissistic pride to isolate us as in devastating silence. Yet, you must internalize this clinical fact. Even when your personal infrastructure is decimated, you always retain the agency to dismantle your ego, exit your self-made shadows, and consciously choose the people you love. The human brain retains incredible neuroplasticity. It is never too late to inhibit a destructive behavioral loop when your internal conscience signals a necessary deviation. You possess the continuous ability to redirect your trajectory toward a healthy support system. If my analysis of this case file resonated with you today, you and I need to continue this clinical evaluation together. Please subscribe, leave a like, and share this analysis with someone requiring proof that positive behavioral shifts are possible. I am highly interested in your personal case studies. Have you ever experienced a visceral somatic marker demanding you halt a destructive path? Has a random environmental variable, like an animal, forcefully altered your cognitive baseline? Document your clinical findings in the comments below. Digital isolation creates a profound psychological vacuum. We cannot quantify the subjects scrolling in depressive isolation, seeking a mechanism for hope. A transparent articulation of your experience could serve as the precise cognitive intervention another exhausted person restores. From my analytical desk to you, I prescribe resilient mental health, a regulated nervous system, and secure emotional attachments. Maintain active surveillance over those who comprise your support network. Never underestimate the therapeutic value of mundane stability, because biological time is a highly finite resource. The ultimate takeaway is brutally simple. When this transmission ceases, Disengage from your device. Locate your primary attachments. Establish direct eye contact and reinforce those vital human bonds tonight.